In this video, we're talking about Chapter 10, Section 3, and the key concept in the video is that Darwin proposed natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. So what I hope you learn in this video is what natural selection is and the 4 principles that led Darwin to come to this idea, and then also how this relates to evolution. There were several key insights that led Darwin to this idea of natural selection. And they actually began before he even set foot on the HMS Beagle for his famous 5-year journey around the world. He noticed that there was a lot of variation in domesticated plants and animals, and he himself was actually a pigeon breeder. So what you see at the bottom of the screen here on the left is just a normal wild pigeon. And then on the right, there are 3 different breeds of pigeons that have been created through artificial selection, much like we have created the dog breeds that we're all familiar with today. So the idea was if you wanted a pigeon with really large tail feathers, you would select parents that had large tail feathers, breed them together, and they would be more likely to produce offspring that had the trait that you desired. So this was artificial selection because it was the human that was choosing what the beneficial trait was. There wasn't necessarily a survival advantage for having these large tail feathers. So natural selection was the idea that the environment or nature was the thing that was selecting what the beneficial adaptations would be instead of humans. And the idea that Darwin had is that if an individual was really well suited for its environment, it would probably be able to pass down that trait to its offspring. So we have the idea of heritability, or being able to inherit a trait, is crucial for the idea of natural selection, because the idea of natural selection is that nature or the environment is going to determine what adaptations are beneficial, but then the heritability is what allows them to be passed down to the next generation. So Darwin called this survival of the fittest, and you've probably heard that term before, but what I want to clarify is that when we say biological fitness, we're not talking about strength or how fast an organism can run or anything like that. We are really talking about the ability of that organism to produce offspring. So let's talk about the 4 principles that led Darwin to come up with the idea of natural selection. The first of these principles is overproduction. Overproduction is simple. Overproduction simply says that in a population there are more offspring produced than can possibly survive. So remember, when we're talking about natural selection and evolution, we're talking about a population, not simply an individual. A population is all the members of the same species that live in the same area. Our example here that we're using is the jaguar. And so this particular jaguar mother has produced 2 cubs, and it is no guarantee that both of those cubs are going to be able to survive to adulthood. That brings us to our second principle, which is variation. Those 2 jaguar cubs and any of the jaguar cubs that are produced in the entire population, they have slight differences from one individual to the next. And one of the differences that is particularly important that we're looking at here is the strength of the jaw and the teeth, because that is a trait that is able to vary from one individual to the next, and it impacts the ability of that individual to get food. So that brings us to our third principle, which is adaptation. And adaptation is a trait that is found in a population or a species that allows that individual or the population to have an advantage and to survive in whatever environment that it lives in. In the case of the jaguar, having very strong jaws and teeth is an adaptation that is very beneficial. You find strong jaws and teeth throughout pretty much all of the jaguars in a population. That's an adaptation that is common to that species. And so whenever you have variation leading to a trait that is beneficial, that beneficial trait can become an adaptation and be something that's found throughout the species. This was an idea that Darwin called descent with modification, because the descendants of the original jaguars would be slightly modified to have stronger and stronger jaws and sharper teeth. And again, this is because the heritability of those traits, the individuals that had the strong jaws and had the sharp teeth would be able to pass those traits down to their offspring. Their offspring would have a survival advantage, and they would have more offspring and pass those traits down to their offspring, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing that's really important to note about natural selection is that it can only act upon existing variation. It cannot create a brand new trait out of nothing. So there has to be an existing trait there. Natural selection can then act on that trait. And if it's a variation that's beneficial, then that is going to continue. And if it's a variation that's not beneficial, then that trait might decrease in the population. So when you have a trait that through natural selection takes on a completely new role, we have a term for that, and that is called an exaptation. This is a really neat idea. The example that I'm giving you here is the thumb of the panda. Now, a panda doesn't really have a thumb like primates have opposable thumbs. Their 5 digits all face the same direction, as you can see in that picture in the center of the slide here. But the panda has a wrist bone that is elongated, and it sticks out kind of like a thumb, and it allows them to hold the bamboo that's their food source. And so at some point, a panda ancestor had this wrist bone that grew longer than it was supposed to, and that's something that's controlled by genetics, but it was actually a benefit. And so it got passed down to the offspring, and the offspring inherited this long wrist bone, and now it looks like the panda has a thumb. So one final thing that I'm going to leave you with is this Chapter 10, Section 3 section quiz. If you could go ahead and read through these questions, pause the video, come up with your answers, and then you can play the video again, and I will go through quickly what these answers should be. All right, let's start with question number 1. The development by scientists of a new color in a rose is the result of B, artificial selection. The key here is it's talking about scientists are developing this new color, so they are artificially selecting it. Number 2, in natural selection, the selective agent is the D, environment. A selective agent means what is the thing that is causing a trait to be beneficial or not. That all has to do with the environment. A desert environment is going to select for certain traits, but if you live in a polar environment, you're going to have very different traits than animals that are living in the desert. So it is the environment that is a selective agent. Number 3, all the rabbits living in a particular area would be an example of a population. Remember, all of the species that live in one area, that is a population. Number 4, a bird that can easily outcompete other birds for food and that can produce many eggs has a high C, fitness. The key here is it's talking about the many eggs. It is producing a lot of offspring, therefore it is very biologically fit. And finally, number 5, which of the following describes natural selection? The correct answer is B, it acts on existing physical traits. Remember, it doesn't create a new trait just because it would be something that the organism would benefit from. It can only act upon existing variation. So hopefully you found this to be a helpful video. As always, if you have any questions, please make sure that you ask those in class.